The first gunshot shattered the tranquility of the Colorado mountainside, sending birds scattering from their perches as the stagecoach rounded the bend on the treacherous mountain road leading to Georgetown. Josephine Parker gripped her seat, knuckles turning white as the second shot followed, this one striking the wooden frame mere inches from her head. "Outlaws," the driver shouted, his voice cracking with panic as he cracked his whip furiously over the team of 4 horses. "Hold on tight, folks." Josephine's heart thundered in her chest, matching the pounding hooves of the horses as they strained against their harnesses. At 22, she had left her comfortable life in Boston behind to accept a teaching position in Georgetown, Colorado, the booming silver mining town nestled in the Rocky Mountains. Nothing in her sheltered upbringing had prepared her for this moment of terror. "Stop the coach." A gruff voice commanded as 6 riders appeared, 3 on each side of the narrow mountain pass, effectively boxing in the stagecoach. Their faces were obscured by bandanas, but their intentions were clear as they brandished revolvers and rifles. The driver cursed under his breath, but pulled back on the reins. The stagecoach lurched to a halt, sending Josephine tumbling against the elderly gentleman seated across from her, the only other passenger on this fateful journey. "Apologies, Miss Parker," the gentleman, a silver-haired banker named Mr. Thornton, said as he steadied her. His voice was calm, but his eyes betrayed his fear. "Everyone out," one of the outlaws shouted, firing a warning shot into the air. "Valuables in the bag and nobody gets hurt." Josephine clutched her small beaded purse to her chest. Inside was nearly every penny she had to her name, money that was meant to establish her new life in Georgetown. Tears stung her eyes as she realized she might not only lose her possessions, but possibly her life on this remote mountain pass. The driver was the first to be dragged from his perch, followed by the shotgun messenger who had clearly been caught unaware by the ambush. Josephine heard a commotion as the outlaws forced open the strongbox that had been secured to the top of the coach. "Ladies and gentlemen, if you'd be so kind," a menacing voice drawled as the stagecoach door was yanked open. A bearded outlaw with cold eyes and a cruel smile extended a burlap sack toward them. "Your valuables, please. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Mr. Thornton slowly reached for his pocket watch, his hands trembling. "This was my father's," he said softly, his dignity remaining intact even as he surrendered the family heirloom. When the outlaw's gaze turned to Josephine, she felt her blood turn to ice. There was something in his eyes, something beyond mere greed that made her skin crawl. "Well now, what do we have here?" he said, reaching for a lock of her chestnut hair that had escaped from her bonnet. "Looks like we got ourselves a real lady. Step out here, darlin'." Josephine recoiled from his touch, pressing herself against the far side of the coach. "Please," she whispered, "take what you want," but the outlaw's laugh cut her off. "Oh, I intend to." Before he could grab her, a new sound cut through the mountain air, a rifle shot, precise and deadly. The outlaw at the door crumpled without another word, falling face first into the dirt. Chaos erupted instantly. "Ambush," one of the remaining outlaws shouted, whirling around to locate the source of the shot. Another crack of gunfire echoed across the mountainside, and a second outlaw fell from his horse with a cry of pain. The remaining 4 bandits scattered for cover, returning fire toward a rocky outcropping above the road. Josephine peered cautiously through the window to see a lone figure moving with startling speed and precision among the boulders. The stranger fired again, his aim unerring as a third outlaw clutched his chest and toppled from his saddle. The odds now evened, the remaining outlaws began to lose their nerve. One of them made a desperate break for escape, spurring his horse down the mountain path, only to be thrown as the rider from the rocks fired again, striking the horse's hindquarters and causing it to rear in panic. "Tucker. Jenkins, fall back." The apparent leader of the outlaws shouted, firing wildly toward their unknown assailant. Josephine caught a glimpse of their defender as he emerged from behind a boulder, tall and broad-shouldered, with a well-worn hat pulled low over his eyes and a determined set to his jaw. He moved with the confidence of a man who had faced death before and wasn't afraid to meet it again. 2 more shots in quick succession, and another outlaw screamed in pain, clutching his shoulder as he retreated. The remaining 2 bandits, realizing their plan had completely unraveled, turned their horses and fled down the mountain path, abandoning their wounded companions. The silence that followed was almost as shocking as the gunfire had been. Josephine found herself holding her breath as the stranger approached the stagecoach, rifle still at the ready as he checked each fallen outlaw to ensure they posed no further threat. When he finally reached the stagecoach, Josephine got her first clear look at their savior. He was younger than she had initially thought, perhaps 30 at most, with several days' worth of stubble on his tanned face and piercing blue eyes that assessed her condition with genuine concern. "Are you hurt, madam?" he asked, his voice deep but gentle. Josephine shook her head, unable to find her voice for a moment. "No, thank you, sir, you saved our lives." He nodded, then turned to check on Mr. Thornton and the coach staff. The driver had suffered a gash to his forehead, and the shotgun messenger was nursing what appeared to be a dislocated shoulder, but miraculously, no one from their party had been killed. "Name's Keane Thompson," the stranger said as he helped Josephine down from the coach. His hand was calloused but steady, and she found herself gripping it perhaps a moment longer than necessary. "I was tracking these outlaws for 3 days. The Blackwater gang's been terrorizing this stretch between Denver and Georgetown for months." "Josephine Parker," she replied, steadying herself on the rocky ground. "I'm the new school teacher for Georgetown." Something flickered in Keane's eyes, surprise, perhaps, or admiration. "Long way from wherever you came from, Miss Parker." "Boston," she supplied, suddenly acutely aware of how out of place her fine traveling clothes and Eastern accent must seem in this wild country. Keane nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "About as far as you can get." The moment was interrupted by a groan from one of the wounded outlaws. Keane's expression hardened as he turned to assess the situation. "Driver's in no shape to continue," he said, glancing at the coach's splintered wheel where a stray bullet had struck it. "And this coach isn't going anywhere fast," Mr. Thornton spoke up, dabbing at a cut on his cheek with a handkerchief. "What do you suggest, Mr. Thompson?" Keane surveyed their surroundings, then looked back at Josephine. "Georgetown's still about 15 miles from here." "I can take Miss Parker on my horse. We'd reach town before nightfall, then send help back for you and these fellows." He gestured to the wounded outlaws. "They need to face justice in a proper court." The driver nodded weakly. "That's sensible. We've got supplies to make camp, and these vermin aren't going anywhere." He spat in the direction of the nearest outlaw. Josephine felt a flutter of apprehension at the thought of riding alone with this stranger, however heroic his actions had been. As if sensing her hesitation, Keane spoke directly to her. "I understand your caution, Miss Parker. If you'd prefer, I can ride for help and return, though that would mean spending the night here." Looking at the wounded driver and the darkening sky, Josephine made her decision. "No, Mr. Thompson, I trust your judgment. I'll accompany you to Georgetown." Keane helped gather her essential belongings into a single valise, leaving her trunk to be retrieved later. Within minutes, he had whistled for his horse, a magnificent chestnut stallion that emerged from the trees where it had been waiting during the gunfight. "This is Rusty," Keane said, patting the horse's neck. "Best horse in Colorado territory, and he knows it too." The animal nickered softly, as if in agreement. With surprising gentleness, Keane helped Josephine mount, then swung up behind her. The proximity was startling. She could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing against her back, the warmth of him a stark contrast to the cooling mountain air. "Hold tight," he advised, reaching around her to take the reins. "The trail gets rough in places." As they set off, Josephine cast one last glance at the stagecoach that had nearly become her coffin. Mr. Thornton gave her a reassuring nod, and the driver raised his hand in a weak salute. Then they were around the bend, the scene of violence disappearing from view as Rusty picked his way carefully down the mountain trail. Josephine found herself acutely aware of the stranger, whose arms encircled her, not touching her directly, but present nonetheless, a protective barrier between her and the wilderness. "Have you been in Colorado territory long, Mr. Thompson?" She asked, partly to distract herself from the precariousness of their situation. "Call me Keane," he replied. "And yes, going on 10 years now, came out after the war like a lot of men." The war between the states had ended just 7 years prior in 1865. Josephine did the mental calculation. Keane must have been very young when he fought. "You were a soldier?" she asked. "Union cavalry," he confirmed. "Thought I'd seen enough violence to last a lifetime." A pause. "I was wrong about that." The simple statement conveyed volumes about the man behind her. Josephine resisted the urge to turn and study his face more closely. "And you?" he asked. "What brings a Boston schoolteacher to the Rockies?" Josephine smiled, though he couldn't see it. "Opportunity. Adventure. A chance to be something more than someone's daughter or sister or eventual wife." The words spilled out with more candor than she'd intended. Keane chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest and against her back. "Georgetown'll give you all the adventure you could want." It's grown fast, maybe too fast. Silver Strike brought in every kind of person you can imagine, including outlaws like those men back there. "The mountains attract two kinds of people," Keane said thoughtfully. "Those running toward something and those running away from something. The trick is figuring out which is which." As they continued their descent, Josephine found herself wondering which category Keane Thompson fell into, and more unsettlingly, which one she truly belonged to herself. The sky deepened toward dusk, the shadows lengthening across the trail as Rusty maintained his steady pace. Occasionally, Keane would point out landmarks or wildlife, a family of deer grazing in a distant meadow, an eagle soaring overhead. Despite the circumstances that had thrown them together, Josephine found herself relaxing in his presence. "There," Keane said after they had ridden for nearly 2 hours. He pointed toward a cluster of lights nestled in the valley below. "Georgetown." Josephine felt a surge of relief mixed with an unexpected twinge of disappointment. Their journey together was nearly at an end. "The town's been growing every day since the Silver Strike," Keane explained as they descended the final stretch of trail. "Rough in places, but decent people too. The school's been waiting for a proper teacher for months." "And what do you do in Georgetown, Mr. Keane?" Josephine asked, correcting herself. There was a pause before he answered. "A little of everything. I've got some mining claims, do some guiding for Eastern investors, and occasionally—" He trailed off. "Occasionally hunt outlaws," she supplied. "Only when necessary," he replied, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "Sheriff Taylor deputizes me sometimes when things get out of hand." The Blackwater gang has been getting bolder. This is the 3rd stagecoach they've hit this month. As they approached the outskirts of town, Josephine could see that Georgetown was indeed a boomtown in every sense. Despite the falling darkness, the main street bustled with activity, saloons with piano music spilling into the street, miners still arriving from the day's work, merchants closing up their shops. It was nothing like the orderly cobblestone streets of Boston, yet it pulsed with a vibrant energy that was undeniably appealing. "Where should I take you?" Keane asked as they rode down the main street, drawing curious glances from passers-by. "The school teachers' quarters aren't ready yet. They're still finishing the new schoolhouse. I was to stay at the Silver Queen Hotel until the quarters were prepared," Josephine said, suddenly aware of how disheveled she must look after the day's ordeal. Keane nodded and guided Rusty toward a 3-story building near the center of town. It was one of the few structures made entirely of brick, with a sign proclaiming it the finest accommodation in the Rockies. As they drew to a halt in front of the hotel, Josephine became intensely conscious of the fact that she would have to disentangle herself from this man who had saved her life just hours earlier. Before she could move, however, a commotion erupted from the hotel as a plump, gray-haired woman burst through the doors. "Josephine Parker, merciful heavens!" the woman exclaimed, rushing down the steps with surprising agility. "We'd given up hope when the stage didn't arrive on schedule, Mrs. Hollister," Josephine guessed, recognizing the name of the school board president who had been corresponding with her. "Indeed. Oh, my dear girl, when we heard reports of more outlaw activity on the pass, we feared the worst. Mrs. Hollister looked up at Keane with newfound appreciation. Mr. Thompson, I might have known you'd be involved if there was trouble. Keane tipped his hat. Evening, Mrs. Hollister. Found Miss Parker and her stagecoach under attack by the Blackwater gang. The others are safe but stranded about 15 miles back. Coach took some damage. By now, a small crowd had gathered, including a weathered man wearing a sheriff's badge who pushed his way forward. Thompson, the sheriff nodded. How many? 6 in total. 2 dead, 2 wounded and secured with the stage, 2 fled south, probably heading for the canyon country. The sheriff spat tobacco juice into the street. I'll organize a party to retrieve the survivors and the wounded. Mrs. Hollister, see to Miss Parker, she's had quite a day by the looks of it. As Keane helped Josephine dismount, their hands met once more. This time, there was a moment brief but undeniable when neither seemed willing to let go. Thank you, Josephine said softly, looking up at him. In the lamplight from the hotel, his features seemed softer somehow. The hardness that had served him well during the gunfight giving way to something more approachable. Just doing what needed doing, he replied, though his eyes suggested it had become more than duty somewhere along that mountain trail. Mrs. Hollister was already ushering Josephine toward the hotel, chattering about hot baths and warm meals, but Josephine turned back once more. Will I see you again, Mr. Thompson? Keane smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his face. Georgetown's not that big a town, Miss Parker. I reckon our paths will cross again. As Mrs. Hollister guided her into the hotel, Josephine found herself hoping that their next meeting would come sooner rather than later. The Silver Queen Hotel proved to be surprisingly luxurious for a mining town, evidence of the wealth that silver had brought to Georgetown. Mrs. Hollister, who revealed herself to be not only the school board president but also the owner of the hotel, insisted on providing Josephine with the finest room available. You poor dear, Mrs. Hollister clucked as she personally supervised the preparation of a hot bath in Josephine's room. Ambushed by outlaws on your first day in Colorado? I'd understand completely if you wanted to take the next stage back to civilization. Josephine smiled as she unpinned her hair, allowing the chestnut waves to fall past her shoulders. Actually, Mrs. Hollister, I find I'm more determined than ever to make a life here. The older woman studied her with shrewd eyes. Is that so? Well, I can't say I'm not pleased to hear it. We've had 3 school teachers come and go in the past year. None had the constitution for frontier life. She paused, adding with a wink, though none of them had the good fortune to be rescued by Keane Thompson either. Josephine felt her cheeks warm. He seems like a remarkable man. That he is, Mrs. Hollister agreed, testing the bathwater with her elbow. Came here with nothing after the war, now owns one of the most promising silver claims in the district. Keeps to himself mostly, but always steps up when the town needs him. She gestured to the steaming tub. Your bath is ready, dear. I'll have supper sent up in an hour. You must be famished. Left alone, Josephine gratefully sank into the hot water, allowing the events of the day to wash over her along with the soothing heat. The face of her rescuer kept returning to her mind, those blue eyes that had assessed her so carefully, the strong hands that had held her steady on the mountain trail. Don't be foolish, she scolded herself aloud. The man saved your life. Gratitude is natural, nothing more. Yet as she dressed in the clean clothes, Mrs. Hollister had provided her trunks would hopefully arrive the next day with the repaired stagecoach. Josephine found herself peering out the window toward the main street, wondering if Keane Thompson might still be in town. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the mountain air crisp as Josephine ventured downstairs to the hotel's dining room. Mrs. Hollister had already arranged for her to meet with several school board members over breakfast, and Josephine found herself quickly immersed in discussions about curriculum, student numbers, and the completion timeline for the new schoolhouse. It should be ready within the month, explained Mr. Daniels, a bearded mine owner who served as the board treasurer. Until then, we've arranged for classes to be held in the back room of the church. You'll have about 30 students ages 6 to 16. Josephine took careful notes, her mind already cataloging the books and materials she would need. And what of the teacher's quarters I was promised? A small but comfortable cabin behind the schoolhouse, Mrs. Hollister assured her. 2 rooms plus a kitchen with a proper stove and pump inside. Quite luxurious by frontier standards. Their meeting was interrupted by a commotion outside, the sound of horses and men's voices raised in conversation. Josephine glanced toward the window and felt her pulse quicken as she recognized Keane Thompson riding alongside the sheriff and several other men, escorting 2 horses pulling a makeshift travois. On it lay the wounded outlaws, bound and under guard. "Ah, they've returned with the prisoners," Mr. Daniels noted with satisfaction. "Thompson got them, did he? Man's a dead shot. Saved my nephew last winter when a mountain lion got too close to their hunting camp." Josephine rose from her seat, drawn to the window by an impulse she couldn't quite name. Outside, Keane dismounted with fluid grace, saying something to the sheriff that made the older man nod in agreement. As if sensing her gaze, Keane looked up toward the hotel window. Their eyes met briefly before Josephine stepped back, oddly flustered at being caught watching. "The stagecoach should arrive by midday with your belongings, Miss Parker," Mrs. Hollister said, either not noticing or politely ignoring Josephine's momentary distraction. "Mr. Thornton was quite adamant that your trunks receive special care." "That's very kind of him," Josephine replied, forcing her attention back to the meeting. "I hope he wasn't too inconvenienced by spending the night on the mountain." "Old Thornton's tougher than he looks," Mr. Daniels chuckled. "Been coming to inspect his bank branches in mining towns for 20 years. Takes more than a night in the wild to rattle him." The meeting concluded with plans for Josephine to visit the temporary classroom that afternoon. As the board members departed, Mrs. Hollister lingered, a knowing expression on her face. "The town's hosting a social at the new assembly hall this Saturday," she mentioned casually. "To welcome you properly, of course, but also to celebrate the completion of the hall. Everyone will be there, miners, merchants, even some of the ranch families from the valley." She paused meaningfully. "I believe Mr. Thompson usually makes an appearance at such functions, despite his preference for solitude." Josephine busied herself arranging her notes. "I look forward to meeting more of the townspeople." Mrs. Hollister's smile suggested she wasn't fooled. "Of course, dear, that's exactly what I meant." Left alone, Josephine debated her next move. She should prepare for her first classroom visit, perhaps review her teaching materials. But the image of Keane Thompson kept intruding on her thoughts. Deciding that fresh air might clear her head, Josephine donned her bonnet and stepped out onto the hotel's front porch. Georgetown sprawled before her, a curious blend of frontier roughness and surprising sophistication. Mining supply stores stood alongside millinery shops. Saloons operated across from a small but well-appointed church. The surrounding mountains provided a majestic backdrop, their peaks still crowned with snow despite the June sunshine. "It grows on you," a familiar voice observed from her left. Josephine turned to find Keane Thompson leaning against the porch railing, hat in hand. He'd clearly cleaned up since his arrival. His dark hair was damp, his face freshly shaved save for a neatly trimmed mustache that somehow suited his strong features. "Mr. Thompson," she acknowledged, hoping her voice didn't betray her pleasure at his appearance. "I didn't expect to see you again so soon." "Told you Georgetown's a small town," he replied with that same hint of a smile she remembered from the night before. "Sheriff wanted my statement about the ambush for his report. Thought I might check if you'd recovered from yesterday's excitement." "Quite well, thank you." Josephine moved to stand beside him at the railing, looking out at the town. "Everyone has been very kind." "I'm to visit my classroom this afternoon." Keane nodded, studying her with those perceptive blue eyes. "You're really staying then, even after what happened?" "It would take more than a few outlaws to drive me away, Mr. Thompson," she replied with more bravado than she truly felt. "Besides, these children need education, especially in a place growing as rapidly as Georgetown." "Keane," he reminded her. "And I'm glad to hear it. Town needs people who aren't just passing through on their way to the next silver strike." Their conversation was interrupted by the distant sound of the stagecoach horn announcing its approach to town. "Looks like your belongings have arrived," Keane observed. "Would you like an escort to meet the stage? Those trunks look heavy for a lady to manage alone." Josephine smiled, recognizing the pretext for what it was but appreciating it nonetheless. "That would be most kind, Mr. Keane." As they walked side by side down Georgetown's Main Street, Josephine was acutely aware of the curious glances from townspeople. A few nodded respectfully to Keane, while others openly stared at the pair, the frontier man with his confident stride and the Eastern lady in her fine clothes, an unlikely duo by any measure. "I'm afraid we're causing quite a stir," Josephine murmured. Keane shrugged, unconcerned. "Small towns run on gossip. By supper time, half the population will have us engaged, and the other half will claim you're secretly my long-lost sister." The absurdity of the suggestion made Josephine laugh, a genuine, unrestrained sound that drew even more attention from passers-by. Keane looked momentarily startled, then pleased. "You should do that more often," he said quietly. "What's that? Laugh like you mean it. Not that polite society laugh I bet you perfected in Boston." Before Josephine could formulate a response, the stagecoach rounded the corner, looking considerably worse for wear after its encounter with the Blackwater gang. Bullet holes peppered its wooden sides, and one of the wheels had been hastily repaired. Mr. Thornton waved from the window, looking remarkably composed despite his ordeal. The driver, his head now bandaged, managed a weary salute as he brought the team to a halt in front of the town's stagecoach office. "Miss Parker, Mr. Thompson." Mr. Thornton called as he carefully descended from the coach. "What a pleasant surprise to find you both here to greet us." "Just ensuring Miss Parker's belongings arrive safely," Keane explained, moving to help the driver with the luggage strapped to the roof. "Most kind," Mr. Thornton said with a knowing glance between them. "I must say, Miss Parker, you're looking remarkably well after yesterday's adventure. Georgetown has been most welcoming," Josephine replied diplomatically. "Indeed." The banker lowered his voice. "I understand from Mrs. Hollister that you're still planning to take up your teaching position. Most commendable. Lesser spirits might have been deterred by such an introduction to frontier life. I've never believed in judging an entire place by one unfortunate incident," Josephine said. "And certain aspects of my arrival were quite reassuring." Her gaze involuntarily drifted to where Keane was effortlessly lifting her largest trunk from the stagecoach roof, the muscles in his arms clearly defined even through his shirt sleeves. When she looked back, Mr. Thornton was watching her with undisguised amusement. "Yes, quite reassuring indeed," he murmured. "Well, I must check on my bank branch. I look forward to seeing you at the social on Saturday, Miss Parker. Georgetown's social events are not to be missed." As Mr. Thornton departed, Keane approached with Josephine's trunk balanced on one shoulder and her smaller valise in his free hand. "Where would you like these, Miss Parker?" "The hotel for now, if you don't mind. Mrs. Hollister says my permanent quarters won't be ready for a few weeks yet." They walked back toward the Silver Queen, Keane carrying her heavy luggage with apparent ease. Along the way, he pointed out various establishments, the mercantile where she could purchase supplies, the small lending library operated by the minister's wife, the doctor's office should she ever need medical attention. "And that's my place," he said casually as they passed a modest cabin set slightly apart from the main street, backed against the pine forest that climbed the mountain. A small corral housed Rusty and another horse, and smoke curled lazily from the stone chimney. "Nothing fancy, but it suits me." Josephine tried to picture Keane in that peaceful setting so different from the man of action who had dispatched armed outlaws with deadly precision. It occurred to her that there were many layers to Keane Thompson that she had yet to discover. At the hotel, Keane carried her trunk up to her room despite Mrs. Hollister's knowing smirk as they passed through the lobby. Setting it down carefully, he straightened and found himself suddenly close to Josephine in the confines of the small room. For a moment, neither spoke. Josephine was aware of his scent, pine and leather, and something uniquely him. His eyes searched hers, and she had the distinct impression that he was about to say something significant. Instead, he cleared his throat and stepped back. "I should let you get settled. I imagine you have preparations to make for your classroom visit." "Yes," she agreed, oddly disappointed. "Thank you for your help with the luggage." Keane paused at the door. "Miss Parker, Josephine," he seemed to be wrestling with his words. "Would you allow me to escort you to the social on Saturday as a proper welcome to Georgetown?" The request was so formally phrased, so at odds with his frontier persona, that Josephine couldn't help but smile. "I would be delighted, Mr. Thompson." His answering smile transformed his face once again. "Until Saturday, then." With a tip of his hat, he was gone, leaving Josephine staring at the closed door with a curious fluttering in her chest that had nothing to do with yesterday's danger, and everything to do with the man who had saved her from it. The days leading up to Saturday's social passed in a whirlwind of activity as Josephine threw herself into preparing for her teaching duties. The temporary classroom in the church annex was small but workable, with rows of simple benches and a blackboard that had seen better days. The school board had provided basic textbooks, though Josephine was dismayed to find that many were outdated or in poor condition. "The children make do with what we have," explained Reverend Michaels, who had been filling in as teacher until Josephine's arrival. "Some of the mining families can barely afford to spare their children for schooling at all. Every pair of hands is needed when you're trying to scratch a living from the earth." Josephine made lists of necessary supplies and spent hours organizing lesson plans appropriate for the wide range of ages and abilities she would be teaching. In the evenings, she took her meals in the hotel dining room, where Mrs. Hollister introduced her to various townspeople eager to meet the new schoolteacher. Throughout it all, Josephine found herself watching for Keane, but their paths did not cross again before Saturday. She learned bits and pieces about him from others: that his silver claim was modest but promising, that he occasionally guided hunting parties into the high country, that he had once tracked a murderer for 3 weeks through a blizzard to bring him to justice. "Not a man to cross," the blacksmith's wife confided over tea, "but there's no one better to have on your side in trouble. My Johnny broke his leg last winter when a horse kicked him 3 feet of snow on the ground and no way to get a doctor. Keane Thompson carried that boy 6 miles through a snowstorm to get him help." By Saturday evening, Josephine had constructed an image of Keane Thompson as some kind of frontier legend, which made her all the more nervous as she prepared for the social. She had unpacked her finest dress from Boston, a deep blue silk with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. It was perhaps too formal for a mining town gathering, but she found herself wanting to impress Mrs. Hollister helped arrange her hair, twisting the chestnut locks into an elegant knot at the nape of her neck with a few artful curls framing her face. "You'll be breaking hearts tonight, my dear," the older woman said with satisfaction. "Every unmarried miner in Georgetown will be lining up for a dance." "I'm not here to find a husband, Mrs. Hollister," Josephine protested mildly. "I came to teach." "Of course you did," Mrs. Hollister replied with a knowing smile. "And I'm sure that's exactly what you'll tell Mr. Thompson when he arrives." Before Josephine could formulate a suitably dignified response, there was a knock at her door. Keane stood in the hallway, and for a moment Josephine hardly recognized him. Gone was the rugged frontiersman. In his place stood a gentleman in a well-cut dark suit, white shirt, and carefully knotted tie. His hair was neatly combed, his boots polished to a shine. Only his tan and those watchful blue eyes remained unchanged. "Miss Parker," he said, his gaze taking in her appearance with undisguised appreciation, "you look beautiful." The simple, direct compliment brought warmth to Josephine's cheeks. "Thank you. You clean up rather nicely yourself, Mr. Thompson." Mrs. Hollister, beaming like a matchmaking fairy godmother, shooed them toward the stairs. "Off with you both. The entire town is waiting to properly welcome our new schoolteacher." The assembly hall was a recent addition to Georgetown, a large wooden structure with a polished floor and lanterns casting a warm glow over the gathered townsfolk. A small group of local musicians played lively tunes as couples twirled across the dance floor. Tables laden with food lined one wall, and punch bowls featured prominently some, Josephine suspected, enhanced with stronger spirits for the male attendees. Their entrance caused a noticeable ripple of interest. Keane offered his arm, and Josephine placed her hand upon it, feeling oddly like royalty as they made their way into the hall. People nodded respectfully to Keane while openly assessing Josephine with curious eyes. "Everyone's staring," she murmured. "Can you blame them?" Keane replied quietly. "Most beautiful woman in Colorado walks in on my arm, I'd stare too." Before Josephine could respond to this unexpectedly gallant remark, they were surrounded by well-wishers school board members introducing their wives, mothers expressing gratitude that their children would finally have a proper teacher, merchants eager to make the acquaintance of Georgetown's newest resident. Throughout it all, Keane remained at her side, a steady presence as she navigated the social waters. She noticed that while people clearly respected him, there was a certain distance they maintained, as though his reputation as a man of action set him slightly apart from everyday society. When the musicians struck up a waltz, Keane turned to her. "Would you do me the honor, Miss Parker?" Josephine placed her hand in his. "I would be delighted, Mr. Thompson, though I should warn you I was taught the Boston version. It may differ from frontier waltzing." His smile held a hint of challenge. "I think I can keep up." As Keane led her onto the dance floor, Josephine realized that whatever she had expected of him, it was not the graceful, confident dance partner who now guided her through the steps with perfect timing. His hand at her waist was respectful yet warm, his lead subtle but unmistakable. "You surprise me, Mr. Thompson," she admitted as they moved smoothly among the other dancers. "I wouldn't have taken you for an accomplished dancer." "My mother's influence," he explained. She was determined that her son would be a gentleman, even on the Kansas frontier where I was raised. Said a man should know how to dance, how to address a lady, and which fork to use at dinner no matter where life took him. She sounds like a wise woman. She was. The past tense hung between them for a moment. "Lost her and my father both to typhoid when I was 16. Joined the Union Army 2 years later when the war broke out." Josephine's heart ached at the simple statement that conveyed so much loss. "I'm sorry." Keane's hand tightened briefly at her waist. "It was a long time ago, but I like to think she'd be pleased to see her dancing lessons weren't wasted." The music drew to a close, and they found themselves standing closer than propriety strictly allowed. Josephine became acutely aware of the warmth of his hand through the silk of her dress, the slight quickening of his breath that matched her own. The spell was broken by a tap on Keane's shoulder. A young miner with a hopeful expression stood waiting. "Might I have the next dance with Miss Parker?" Keane stepped back, his expression carefully neutral as he nodded. "Of course." The next hour passed in a blur as Josephine was claimed for dance after dance. She met what felt like half the population of Georgetown, struggling to remember names and connections as she was passed from one partner to the next. Through it all, she remained conscious of Keane's presence, sometimes at the edge of the dance floor, sometimes in conversation with the sheriff or other men, but always somehow aware of her, his gaze finding hers across the room at odd moments. Finally, when Josephine thought her feet might not manage another step, Keane appeared at her side with 2 cups of punch. "You look like you could use a rest," he observed, handing her a cup. "The menfolk of Georgetown aren't known for their restraint when a beautiful new lady arrives in town." Josephine sipped the punch gratefully. "They've been very welcoming, though I fear I've forgotten most of their names already. Don't worry, you'll have plenty of time to sort them out." Keane gestured toward an open door. "Would you care for some air? It's getting rather warm in here." The night air was cool and refreshing after the heat of the crowded hall. Keane led her to a small porch that overlooked the main street of Georgetown, now quiet except for the sounds of music and laughter from the social. Above them, the night sky was a tapestry of stars, brighter and more numerous than Josephine had ever seen in Boston. "It's beautiful," she breathed, gazing upward. "One of the things I love about this country," Keane agreed, looking up at the stars. No matter how rough things get, you can always look up and remember there's something bigger than your troubles. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the sounds of the social fading into the background. "May I ask you something, Keane?" Josephine finally said. "Anything." "Why did you really come to my rescue on the mountain pass? The driver said the stage was running late. You must have been waiting specifically for it." Keane considered her question, his expression thoughtful in the moonlight. "The truth, I'd been tracking the Blackwater gang for days. They'd robbed 2 other stages that month, killed a guard on the last one. Sheriff asked me to try to predict their next move. So it was just duty," Josephine said, trying to keep the disappointment from her voice. "At first," Keane admitted. "But when I saw you through my spyglass, saw you refuse to cower even with that outlaw threatening you, it became something more." He turned to face her fully. "I've never met anyone like you, Josephine Parker. Most Eastern ladies would have fainted dead away at the first gunshot, but you kept your composure through the whole ordeal." "I was terrified," she confessed. "I just didn't see how showing it would help matters." "That's courage," Keane said simply. "Not the absence of fear, but facing it anyway." Their eyes met, and Josephine felt something shift between them, a recognition, perhaps, that their connection went beyond the circumstances of their meeting. Keane's gaze dropped briefly to her lips, and she found herself leaning slightly toward him, drawn by a force she couldn't quite name. The moment was shattered by the assembly hall door banging open as several revelers spilled onto the porch, laughing and talking loudly. Josephine stepped back, suddenly aware of how their proximity might appear to others. "I should probably return to the social," she said regretfully. "As the guest of honor, my absence will be noticed," Keane nodded, offering his arm once more. "Of course." As they rejoined the celebration, Josephine couldn't help but wonder what might have happened if they'd had just a few more moments alone beneath the stars. The weeks following the social brought a whirlwind of change for Josephine as she fully embraced her role as Georgetown's schoolteacher. Classes began in earnest, and she found herself challenged and rewarded in equal measure by her diverse group of pupils, from the shy 6-year-old daughter of the hotel cook to the 16-year-old son of a mine owner who clearly believed his education complete. The new schoolhouse progressed rapidly, with the entire town pitching in to ensure its completion before the first snow. Josephine often stopped by after her teaching day to check on the progress, offering suggestions about the classroom layout or the placement of windows for optimal light. It was during one such visit, nearly a month after her arrival in Georgetown, that she encountered Keane again. Their paths had crossed briefly since the social, a nod on the street, a quick exchange of pleasantries after Sunday services, but their conversation had always been observed by others, never allowing for the kind of private moment they had shared on the porch. Josephine was examining the newly installed blackboard when a familiar voice spoke from the doorway. "Will it do, Miss Parker?" She turned to find Keane leaning against the doorframe, a hammer in hand and sawdust clinging to his shirt sleeves. It took her a moment to process the implication. "You're helping with the construction," he shrugged, stepping into the classroom. "I know my way around a hammer and saw, figured an extra pair of hands might speed things along." "That's very civic-minded of you, Mr. Thompson," she replied, unable to suppress a smile. "I wouldn't have taken you for a man with an interest in education." "I've developed a recent interest in teachers," he countered, his eyes twinkling. "Specifically, Eastern ones with more courage than sense who decide to start new lives in mining towns." The easy banter felt like a return to the connection they had begun to establish the night of the social. Josephine moved toward the windows, ostensibly to check their placement. "The light is perfect," she observed. "Exactly where I suggested." "I may have had something to do with that," Keane admitted, joining her by the window. "Had to convince old Jenkins that moving them 2 feet to the left wouldn't bring the whole building down." They stood side by side, looking out at the spectacular view of the mountains that the classroom windows framed. "The children will never pay attention to their lessons with that outside," Josephine sighed. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing," Keane suggested. Part of their education should be learning to appreciate where they live. Josephine studied him with new interest. You're full of surprises, Keane Thompson, a frontiersman philosopher who can waltz and believes in the educational value of mountain views. Don't tell anyone, he said in a stage whisper. I've got a reputation to maintain. Their laughter filled the empty classroom, and Josephine was struck by how comfortable she felt in his presence. There was none of the carefully scripted interaction she had known with gentlemen in Boston, just an honest connection that seemed to deepen with each meeting. I hear your teacher's cabin is almost ready, Keane said after a moment. Jenkins says another week should do it. Yes, Mrs. Hollister has been most accommodating, but I'm looking forward to having my own space. Josephine hesitated, then added, perhaps when I'm settled you might come for tea, as a thank you for all your help with the schoolhouse. The invitation was forwarded by Boston standards, an unmarried lady inviting a gentleman to her home, even for something as innocent as tea, but Georgetown operated by different rules. Keane's expression softened. I'd like that very much, Josephine. The sound of her name on his lips sent a pleasant shiver through her. Before she could respond, however, a crash and a shout from outside broke the moment. Thompson, need your help with this support beam, Jenkins, the head carpenter, called from the yard. Keane sighed. Duty calls. Jenkins is a fine builder, but he tends to underestimate how many men it takes to lift a beam. He turned to go, then paused in the doorway. About that tea, let me know when you're settled. I make it a point never to keep a lady waiting. With a tip of his hat, he was gone, leaving Josephine wondering how a simple invitation for tea could feel so much like the beginning of something momentous. The teacher's cabin exceeded Josephine's expectations when she finally moved in a week later. Though small, it was solidly built with careful attention to details that would make frontier life more comfortable. Shelves for her books, a sturdy writing desk positioned to catch the morning light, a kitchen with a proper cast iron stove rather than the open hearths many cabins relied upon. Most surprising was the small covered porch that faced west, providing a perfect view of the sunset behind the mountains. When Josephine commented on this thoughtful addition, Mrs. Hollister's eyes twinkled. I believe Mr. Thompson suggested that particular feature, she said innocently. Something about teachers needing a place to grade papers in the fresh air. Josephine felt her cheeks warm at this evidence that Keane had taken a personal interest in her comfort. That was very considerate of him. Mrs. Hollister agreed, clearly enjoying Josephine's reaction. He even delivered a rocking chair for your porch yesterday while you were teaching. Said it came from his own cabin, belonged to a friend who moved on to California. The chair in question was simple but beautifully crafted, with armrests worn smooth by years of use. Josephine ran her fingers over the polished wood, imagining Keane taking the time to bring it from his home to hers. You know, Mrs. Hollister continued casually, in the 3 years I've known Keane Thompson, I've never seen him take such an interest in town improvements or in any lady for that matter. She patted Josephine's hand. Just an observation, my dear. That evening, after Mrs. Hollister had departed, and Josephine had arranged her belongings to her satisfaction. She sat in the rocking chair on her porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. The air was cooling as summer gave way to early autumn, but it remained pleasant enough to sit outside with just a light shawl. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention to the path leading to her cabin. Rusty's chestnut coat gleamed in the fading light as Keane guided him toward her home. He had clearly come directly from his claim. His clothes bore the dust of the mines, and tools were strapped behind his saddle. Hope I'm not intruding, he called as he dismounted. Tying Rusty to the hitching post Josephine now noticed had been installed at the edge of her small yard. Not at all, she replied, rising to greet him. I was just admiring the sunset and the chair someone thoughtfully provided for that purpose. Keane had the grace to look slightly abashed. Mrs. Hollister has a loose definition of confidentiality. He removed his hat, running a hand through his dark hair. I just thought you might appreciate somewhere to sit at the end of the day. I do, Josephine assured him. It's perfect. Would you like to join me? I could make that tea I promised. Keane glanced down at his dusty clothes. I'm not exactly presentable for social calls. This isn't Boston, Mr. Thompson, Josephine reminded him with a smile. I believe Georgetown's social standards allow for a bit of honest mining dust. He returned her smile, the tension in his shoulders easing. In that case, tea would be most welcome. Josephine busied herself in the small kitchen, heating water on her new stove while Keane examined the cabin with apparent approval. They did good work, he commented, running a hand along the solid pine shelving. This place should keep you warm even in February when the real cold sets in. Is winter here very severe? Josephine asked as she prepared the tea tray. It can be, Keane acknowledged. Snow deep enough to bury a man in places, temperatures that'll freeze water solid in the time it takes to say Jack Robinson. But beautiful too, the mountains all white and silent, sunlight on fresh snow bright enough to blind you. He paused, looking at her directly. I hope you'll stay long enough to see it. The simple statement held a question Josephine wasn't quite ready to answer. I signed a contract for the full school year, she said instead, carrying the tea tray to the small table. I'm not in the habit of breaking my commitments. They settled into a surprisingly comfortable domestic routine, Keane building a small fire in the hearth as the evening air cooled. Josephine pouring tea and offering the simple biscuits Mrs. Hollister had provided as a housewarming gift. Their conversation flowed easily, covering topics from the progress of Josephine's students to Keane's latest findings at his silver claim. It's looking promising, he said when she inquired about his mining venture. Nothing spectacular like some of the big strikes, but steady. Enough that I could expand operations if I wanted to. And do you? Josephine asked. Want to expand, I mean, Keane considered the question, turning his teacup in his hands. I've been thinking lately that there might be more to life than pulling silver from the ground. His eyes met hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. Things worth investing in beyond minerals and ore. The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken possibilities. Josephine found herself leaning slightly forward, drawn once again by that invisible pull she had felt on the night of the social. Keane, she began, not entirely sure what she meant to say. A sudden pounding at her door shattered the moment. Miss Parker, are you there? A young voice called urgently. Keane was on his feet instantly, moving to the door with the swift alertness that had served him well during the Stagecoach ambush. He opened it to reveal Tommy Jenkins, the 12-year-old son of the head carpenter, his face flushed with exertion. What is it, Tommy? Josephine asked, rising from her chair. It's Pa, the boy gasped. There was an accident at the Maginty mine cave and they're bringing him to Doc Wilson's now. Keane's expression turned grim. How bad? Don't know, sir. Ma sent me to fetch Miss Parker, said she might need help with the little ones while Ma stays with Pa at the doctor's. Josephine was already reaching for her shawl. Of course, let me get my things. Keane touched her arm. I'll take you on Rusty, it'll be faster than walking, and the doctor's place is on the other side of town. Minutes later, Josephine found herself once again seated in front of Keane on his horse, his arms around her as they made their way through Georgetown's darkening streets. This time, however, there was no uncertainty between them, only shared purpose, and the silent acknowledgement that whatever had begun to develop in their quiet moments together would have to wait. The next few days were a blur of activity as the town rallied around the Jenkins family. Mr. Jenkins had suffered a broken leg and several cracked ribs in the mine collapse, but Dr. Wilson assured everyone that with proper rest, he would make a full recovery. In the meantime, however, his family needed support. Josephine threw herself into helping Mrs. Jenkins manage her 4 younger children, often staying late into the evening to assist with meals and bedtimes after her teaching duties were complete. Throughout it all, she was aware of Keane's parallel efforts organizing a crew of miners to complete work on the schoolhouse in Jenkins' absence, arranging for wood to be chopped and stacked for the family's winter needs, quietly ensuring that pay from the mine owners continued despite Jenkins' inability to work. They rarely had time for more than brief exchanges during this period. Yet Josephine felt their connection deepening through this shared service, a partnership forming through actions rather than words. It was nearly 2 weeks later, with Jenkins on the mend and the family situation stabilized, that Keane appeared at the schoolhouse as Josephine was dismissing her students for the day. "Miss Parker," he greeted her formally, mindful of the curious eyes of her pupils. "I wondered if I might have a word when you're finished." The last child departed, and Josephine turned to find Keane studying her with a warmth that made her pulse quicken. "You've been working too hard," he observed, noting the shadows beneath her eyes. "Between teaching and helping the Jenkins family, you've hardly had a moment to yourself," says the man who's been rebuilding a schoolhouse by day and standing guard at a mine by night, Josephine countered, having heard from Mrs. Hollister about Keane's additional duties since the accident. He smiled, acknowledging the point. "Which is why I've come with a proposition. We both need a day away from our responsibilities." He hesitated, then continued with uncharacteristic uncertainty. "There's a place I'd like to show you, a hidden lake about an hour's ride from here. The aspens are turning gold and it's something I think you'd appreciate." The invitation hung between them, more significant than tea in her cabin, a deliberate step toward something beyond friendship. "I have no classes tomorrow," Josephine said softly. "The children have the day off while Reverend Michaels uses the church for harvest preparations." "I could call for you at 9, Keane suggested. "Bring a picnic lunch." "I would like that very much." His smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Until tomorrow then, Miss Parker." Josephine spent far too much time that evening selecting appropriate attire, for their outing finally settling on her most practical riding skirt and a blouse that happened to match the blue of her eyes. She told herself the extra care was simply respect for the occasion, but the flutter in her stomach as she pinned her hair suggested otherwise. True to his word, Keane arrived at precisely 9 o'clock the next morning, Rusty looking particularly well-groomed, and a second horse, a gentle-looking mare, trailing behind. "Morning, Miss Parker," he greeted her, the formality of his words belied by the warmth in his eyes. "This is Daisy. Owner of the livery owed me a favor, thought you might be more comfortable with your own mount for the journey." Josephine approached the mare, stroking her velvet nose. "She's beautiful, thank you for thinking of it." "Didn't figure you for the type of lady who'd want to be carted around all day," Keane said, helping her mount. "Something tells me you prefer making your own way." The observation was so perceptive, so aligned with Josephine's own sense of herself, that she momentarily struggled to respond. "You're more observant than most, Mr. Thompson. Part of staying alive out here," he replied, swinging effortlessly onto Rusty's back, paying attention to details others miss. They set out at a comfortable pace, leaving Georgetown behind as they followed a trail that wound upward through pine forests and meadows dotted with late summer wildflowers. Keane proved to be a knowledgeable guide, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of the area's history, both recent mining developments and older tales of the Ute tribes who had once made these mountains their home. "They had a different relationship with this land than we do," he explained as they paused to rest the horses in a high meadow. "Took what they needed, no more, respected the balance." "You sound almost as though you admire them," Josephine observed. "I respect their understanding of this country," Keane said carefully. "Spent some time with a Ute guide after the war, taught me how to read the mountains, how to survive when nature turns against you. Made me see that most of what we call civilization is just a thin veneer over something much older and more powerful." This philosophical side of Keane continued to surprise Josephine. The man was far more complex than the frontier legend Georgetown's gossips had described. They continued their journey, climbing higher until they crested a ridge that revealed a hidden valley beyond. Nestled within it was a lake of such pristine beauty that Josephine gasped audibly, its surface a perfect mirror reflecting the surrounding peaks and the brilliant gold of aspen trees that lined its shores. "Oh, Keane," she breathed, forgetting formality in her wonder. "It's magnificent." He watched her reaction with evident pleasure. Thought you might appreciate it. Not many folks from Georgetown know about this place. It's a bit off the usual trails. They descended to the lakeshore, where Keane selected a sunny spot beneath a stand of aspens for their picnic. The golden leaves rustled overhead, occasionally detaching to spiral down around them like nature's own confetti. The picnic Keane unpacked was simple but thoughtful: fresh bread, smoked ham, cheese, apples, and a bottle of surprisingly good wine. As they ate, their conversation ranged widely from Josephine's childhood in Boston to Keane's experiences during the war, from favorite books to dreams for the future. "I never intended to stay in Georgetown this long," Keane admitted as they lingered over the last of the wine. "Came here looking for a quick silver strike, figured I'd move on once I'd made my fortune." "What changed?" Josephine asked, genuinely curious. Keane gazed out over the lake, his expression thoughtful. "Found something I wasn't looking for, I guess, a community. A place where a man's word still matters, land that gets under your skin until you can't imagine being anywhere else." He turned to her, his blue eyes intent. "And then, more recently, another reason to stay." The implication hung between them, clear and unmistakable. Josephine felt her heartbeat accelerate, aware that they were approaching a precipice of sorts, a moment that would define whatever was developing between them. "I came to Georgetown seeking independence," she said carefully. "In Boston, I was always someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's potential wife, never just Josephine." She met his gaze directly. "I didn't come looking for attachments." "And yet," Keane prompted softly when she hesitated, "and yet I find myself thinking that perhaps independence doesn't have to mean solitude." Josephine looked down at her hands, then back up at him with newfound courage. "Perhaps it means being free to choose one's own attachments, rather than having them dictated by society or family expectations." The smile that spread across Keane's face was like watching the sun break through storm clouds. Without a word, he reached across the picnic blanket to take her hand in his calloused palm warm against her skin. "Josephine Parker," he said, his voice low and serious, "I believe you may be the bravest person I've ever met. Not because you faced down outlaws without flinching, but because you had the courage to leave everything familiar behind to forge your own path." He shifted closer, still holding her hand. "I'm not a man who finds words easy," he admitted. "But I need to tell you that from the moment I saw you on that stagecoach, refusing to cower even with guns pointed at you, I knew you were someone extraordinary." "Keane," Josephine began, but he gently placed a finger against her lips. "Let me finish before my courage fails me." He took a deep breath. "I'm not a wealthy man, and this country is still rough in ways that must shock you daily. I can't offer you the kind of life you knew in Boston. But if you could see your way clear to considering a future that includes me, I swear I would spend every day trying to deserve that honor." It wasn't quite a proposal, more an opening of possibilities, but Josephine felt its significance resonate through her entire being. This was the crossroads she had sensed approaching since that first night on the mountain pass. "I left Boston seeking a new life," she said slowly, not knowing exactly what form it would take. "I certainly never imagined being rescued by outlaws, by a man who would come to mean so much to me in such a short time." She turned her hand in his so their fingers interlaced. "I don't know what the future holds, Keane Thompson, but I find I very much want to discover it with you beside me." The tension that had held Keane's body rigid seemed to dissolve. With exquisite gentleness, he raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that sent a shiver through her entire body. "May I?" he asked softly, his meaning clear as he leaned slightly toward her. In answer, Josephine closed the distance between them, her free hand rising to rest against his chest as their lips met in a kiss that felt simultaneously like a culmination and a beginning, tender at first, then deepening with a passion that surprised them both. When they finally separated, both slightly breathless, Keane rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that since the night of the social," he confessed. "I've been hoping you would," Josephine admitted with a small laugh. They remained by the lake until late afternoon, alternating between conversation and comfortable silences, occasional kisses and shared dreams. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Keane reluctantly suggested they start back to Georgetown. "Much as I'd like to stay here forever," he said, helping Josephine to her feet, "I promise to have you back before dark. Your reputation has survived one night on a mountain with me might not weather a second." The ride back to town was filled with a new awareness between them, a sense of possibilities unfolding and promises waiting to be kept. As they approached Georgetown, the last rays of sunlight gilding the mountain slopes, Josephine felt a certainty settle in her heart that she had found not just a new home but a new future, one far richer than anything she could have imagined when she boarded that fateful stagecoach. The change in their relationship did not go unnoticed in Georgetown. Though both Josephine and Keane maintained professional decorum in public, the connection between them was evident to anyone with eyes to see. Mrs. Hollister was particularly smug, claiming credit for having seen the potential from the very beginning. As autumn deepened toward winter, their courtship progressed with a natural rhythm that suited them both. Keane often escorted Josephine to community gatherings, and she occasionally joined him for Sunday dinners at his cabin, where she discovered he was a surprisingly competent cook. They took regular rides into the mountains when weather permitted, exploring hidden valleys and dramatic vistas that few Georgetown residents had ever seen. The new schoolhouse was completed just as the first snow dusted the highest peaks. The town celebrated with a dedication ceremony followed by a potluck supper, where Josephine found herself treated not as an outsider, but as a valued member of the community. When Keane stood beside her during Reverend Michael's blessing of the building, his hand discreetly finding hers as the townspeople bowed their heads in prayer, she felt a sense of belonging that transcended anything she had known in Boston. Winter arrived with a vengeance in late November, a howling blizzard that dropped 3 feet of snow in a single night, transforming Georgetown into a white wonderland, and effectively isolating it from the outside world for nearly a week. Keane appeared at Josephine's cabin before dawn on the first day of the storm, armed with extra firewood and provisions. "Thought you might need these," he explained as he stamped snow from his boots on her porch. "First big storm can catch newcomers unprepared." Though Josephine assured him she had ample supplies, she was touched by his thoughtfulness and secretly relieved when the worsening storm provided a reasonable excuse for him to remain rather than risk the treacherous journey back to his own cabin. They spent the day in comfortable domesticity, Keane reinforcing her windows against the wind, while Josephine prepared hearty stews and baked bread in her cast iron stove. As darkness fell and the storm intensified, they sat before the fire reading aloud from Josephine's collection of Shakespeare. Keane, revealing yet another surprising facet of himself with his thoughtful interpretation of the bard's words. When it became clear that the storm showed no signs of abating, Josephine faced a moment of decision. Propriety dictated that Keane should brave the blizzard to return to his own home, regardless of the danger. Her heart, however, rejected the notion entirely. "You can't possibly go out in this," she said firmly, gesturing toward the windows where snow now reached halfway up the panes. "It would be madness." Keane studied her face, understanding the implications of her statement. "What will people say?" "They'll say you saved my life a second time by ensuring I didn't freeze to death in my first Colorado blizzard," Josephine replied with more confidence than she felt. "And if they say otherwise, well, I've discovered I care far less about idle gossip than I once did." A slow smile spread across Keane's face. "You continue to surprise me, Josephine Parker." "Good," she said, returning his smile. "I'd hate to become predictable." That night, Keane slept wrapped in blankets on the floor before the hearth while Josephine took her bed. Though they maintained this proper arrangement throughout the 3 days, the storm confined them to the small cabin. Something fundamental shifted in their relationship during that time, a deeper intimacy born of shared meals and conversations, of seeing each other at their most unguarded in the enforced proximity of the blizzard. By the time the storm cleared and paths were shoveled through Georgetown's snow-laden streets, Most of the town had guessed that Keane had weathered the blizzard at the schoolteacher's cabin. To Josephine's surprise, the reaction was less scandal than pragmatic acceptance, a recognition that frontier survival sometimes required setting aside Eastern conventions. "Did you expect them to run me out of town on a rail?" she asked Mrs. Hollister when the older woman made an oblique reference to Keane's extended presence during the storm. "My dear, this isn't Boston," Mrs. Hollister replied with a wink. "Out here, we judge people by their character, not by whether they adhere to rules made by folks who have never had to survive a Rocky Mountain winter." She patted Josephine's hand. "Besides, everyone knows Keane Thompson is an honorable man. If he spent 3 days under your roof during a blizzard, I've no doubt propriety was maintained." Her knowing smile, however, suggested that she wouldn't have been particularly scandalized if it hadn't been. As Christmas approached, Georgetown transformed under a blanket of snow and festive decorations. Evergreen boughs adorned storefronts, candles glowed in windows, and the entire community seemed determined to celebrate the holiday with particular enthusiasm. Josephine threw herself into preparations for the school's Christmas pageant, working with her students to create a performance that combined traditional carols with a nativity play. Keane volunteered to build the simple set pieces, working alongside the children with a patience that revealed yet another side of his character. "You're good with them," Josephine observed one afternoon as she watched him help 10-year-old Billy Foster construct a remarkably convincing manger from scrap lumber. Keane looked up, a flash of vulnerability crossing his face. "Never really thought about it. Just treating them like people, I suppose. Have you ever considered having children of your own?" The question slipped out before Josephine could reconsider its implications. A slow smile spread across Keane's face. "More and more frequently of late," he replied, holding her gaze until her cheeks flushed with color. The pageant was a rousing success, drawing the entire town to the new schoolhouse on the last day before the Christmas break. Parents beamed with pride, children performed with varying degrees of nervousness and enthusiasm, and Reverend Michaels pronounced it the finest Christmas celebration Georgetown had ever seen. As the families dispersed into the snowy evening, Keane approached Josephine with an uncharacteristic air of formality. "I have something for you," he said, producing a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with a simple red ribbon. "An early Christmas gift if you'll accept it." Curious, Josephine unwrapped the package to reveal a small wooden box, beautifully carved with a pattern of mountain wildflowers. Opening it, she gasped at the sight of a delicate silver ring nestled on a bed of velvet, a simple band set with a small but perfect diamond that caught the lamplight. "It's not grand," Keane said quietly, "but it's genuine like my feelings for you." Josephine looked up to find him watching her with an expression that combined hope, vulnerability, and absolute certainty. "Josephine Parker," he continued, taking her hand, "I know we've known each other only a few months, but in that time, you've become the center of my world. When I think of the future, any future worth having, I can only imagine it with you by my side." He took a deep breath. "Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears filled Josephine's eyes as the full significance of the moment washed over her. She had come to Colorado seeking independence, never imagining that she would find a love that would enhance rather than diminish her sense of self. "Yes," she whispered, then more firmly, "Yes, Keane Thompson, I will marry you." His face transformed with joy as he slipped the ring onto her finger. Then, heedless of the few remaining parents gathering children and wraps near the door, he pulled her into his arms and sealed their engagement with a kiss that promised a lifetime of passion and partnership. News of their engagement spread through Georgetown with the speed that only small-town gossip networks can achieve. By Christmas Eve, Josephine found herself the recipient of congratulations and well wishes from what felt like the entire population, with Mrs. Hollister taking particular satisfaction in having known all along that they were perfect for each other. They were married on New Year's Day of 1873, with Reverend Michaels officiating in the church, decorated with pine boughs and winter berries. The entire town turned out for the celebration, transforming what might have been a simple ceremony into a community festival that continued well into the night. Josephine wore a gown of ivory silk that Mrs. Hollister had helped her alter from one of her Boston dresses, with a crown of evergreen replacing the traditional orange blossoms unavailable in a Colorado winter. Keane, looking both uncomfortable and handsome in a new suit, watched her walk down the aisle with an expression of such naked adoration that several of the town's matrons were observed dabbing at their eyes. Their vows were simple but heartfelt, reflecting both their individual strengths and their commitment to building a life together. When Reverend Michaels finally pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up from the assembled townspeople nearly raised the church roof. The reception that followed at the assembly hall featured enough food to feed Georgetown twice over, music from every instrument that could be mustered, and dancing that continued until the early hours of the morning. Throughout it all, Keane rarely left Josephine's side, his hand finding hers as naturally as breathing, his eyes returning to her face with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude that someone so remarkable had chosen to share his life. As midnight approached and some of the older guests began to depart, Keane leaned close to whisper in his new wife's ear. "Ready to see your wedding present?" Josephine looked up at him, puzzled. "Beyond this beautiful ring and the title of Mrs. Thompson." "Something a bit more substantial," he replied with a mysterious smile. "If you're willing to slip away for a while." Intrigued, Josephine allowed him to lead her from the hall, pausing only long enough to don their winter wraps before stepping out into the crisp, starlit night. Rusty stood waiting, decorated for the occasion with ribbons on his bridle, alongside a small sleigh that Josephine had never seen before. "Whose sleigh is this?" she asked as Keane handed her into the seat and tucked warm blankets around her. "Ours," he replied, climbing in beside her and taking up the reins. "Well, technically, it's part of a package, you'll see." They glided through Georgetown's snow-covered streets, the runners of the sleigh making a hushed, swishing sound that seemed to underscore the magical quality of the night. Instead of turning toward either Keane's cabin or Josephine's teacher's quarters, however, he guided Rusty up a small rise just at the edge of town, where a new cabin stood larger than either of their current homes, with light glowing from its windows and smoke curling from the chimney. "Keane?" Josephine questioned as they drew to a halt before the cabin. "Welcome home, Mrs. Thompson," he said simply, helping her from the sleigh, "if it meets with your approval." Stunned, Josephine allowed him to lead her to the door, which he opened with a flourish to reveal an interior that combined the best elements of both their homes, her books already arranged on built-in shelves, his comfortable furniture positioned before a stone fireplace, new curtains framing windows that offered views of both the town and the mountains beyond. She stammered, turning in a slow circle to take in what was clearly meant to be their marital home. "Been working on it since October," Keane admitted, watching her reaction carefully. "With help from half the men in town, wanted it to be a surprise." He took her hands in his. "I know you value your independence, and I'd never ask you to give up teaching. But I thought we might want a place that was truly ours, not mine that you moved into, or yours that I joined, but something we could build a life in together." Tears spilled down Josephine's cheeks as the full measure of his thoughtfulness registered. This wasn't just a house, it was a physical manifestation of his understanding of who she was and what their partnership could be. "It's perfect," she whispered, wrapping her arms around his neck. "Absolutely perfect." Keane's arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer. "There's more to see: a proper study for your lesson plans, a spare room that could be a nursery someday." He hesitated, suddenly uncertain if that's something you might want. Josephine's heart swelled with emotion. "I can think of nothing I'd want more than to raise children with you, Keane Thompson." Their kiss deepened, taking on a new urgency as the reality of their marriage and the privacy of their new home fully registered. When they finally separated, both breathless, Keane rested his forehead against hers. "Perhaps we should continue the tour later," he suggested, his voice husky with desire, Josephine smiled, her earlier nervousness about their wedding night transformed into anticipation. "I think that would be wise, Mr. Thompson." Later, as they lay tangled together in the new bed that had mysteriously been made up with fresh linens and warmed by hot bricks before their arrival, Mrs. Hollister's doing, Josephine suspected. Keane traced lazy patterns on his wife's bare shoulder. "Happy?" he asked softly. Josephine pressed a kiss to his chest directly over his heart. "Beyond anything I could have imagined when I boarded that stagecoach." She propped herself up on one elbow to look into his eyes. "Are you, more than I deserve?" he answered honestly. "When I rode out to intercept the Blackwater gang that day, I was just doing what needed doing. Never expected to find the other half of my soul in the process." The simple declaration, so characteristic of Keane's straightforward manner yet so profound in its meaning, brought fresh tears to Josephine's eyes. "I love you," she whispered, the words feeling both momentous and entirely natural. Keane's answering smile illuminated his face. "And I love you, Josephine Thompson, more than I have words to say." As they drifted toward sleep, secure in each other's arms while snow fell gently outside their window, Josephine reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. From the terror of the stagecoach ambush to the joy of finding a partner who valued her strength as much as her softness. It had been a path she could never have anticipated, but one she would never regret taking. Spring arrived late in the high country, the snow lingering in shaded areas even as wildflowers began to carpet sun-warmed meadows. Josephine continued teaching, finding that marriage to Keane enhanced rather than diminished her standing in the community. Her students adored Mr. Thompson, who occasionally stopped by the schoolhouse to demonstrate practical applications of their mathematics lessons through carpentry, or to share first-hand accounts of Colorado history. Keane divided his time between his silver claim, which continued to produce modest but steady returns, and various projects around Georgetown. With the town's growth stabilizing, he found himself increasingly drawn to ranching, acquiring a small herd of cattle that he pastured in a valley below their cabin. "Mining's a young man's game," he explained when Josephine questioned the new venture, "and it's always about taking from the land. Ranching feels more like working with it, building something that can last." Their first anniversary found them more deeply in love than either had thought possible, their different backgrounds and experiences proving complementary rather than divisive as they built their life together. The spare room remained a spare room, though not for lack of trying, and occasionally Josephine caught a shadow of worry in Keane's eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. It was late summer, nearly 2 years after Josephine's arrival in Georgetown, when the stagecoach brought news that would alter the course of their lives once more. A letter arrived from Boston, the first communication from Josephine's family since a terse acknowledgement of her marriage announcement. "My sister's husband has died," Josephine explained as she read the closely written pages. "Influenza. She has 3 small children and no means of support." She looked up at Keane, her expression troubled. "She asks if she might come west to join us, says there's nothing left for her in Boston but memories and debts." Keane considered this for only a moment before nodding decisively. "Family's family. Tell her she's welcome." "Are you certain?" Josephine pressed, knowing how he valued their privacy. "It would mean 4 more people in our home, at least temporarily." "I seem to recall vowing to share all I have with you," Keane replied with a small smile. "If your sister and her children need shelter, our home is open to them." He took her hand, his expression growing more serious. "Besides, this place could use the sound of children's laughter." The unspoken acknowledgement of their own continued childlessness hung between them for a moment before Josephine squeezed his hand gratefully. "I'll write to her today." Julia Parker Collins and her 3 children, Robert, age 7, Eleanor, age 5, and baby Thomas, arrived in Georgetown as the aspens were turning gold, looking exhausted but hopeful after their long journey from the east. Keane met them at the stagecoach stop, much as he had met Josephine 2 years earlier, though under considerably less dramatic circumstances. The adjustment wasn't without challenges. Julia, recently widowed and still in the grip of grief, initially found Georgetown primitive and its inhabitants alarmingly direct. The children, accustomed to the constraints of Boston society, were both frightened and exhilarated by the freedom of the mountains. But as weeks passed, something remarkable began to happen. Julia's pale complexion gained color from the mountain air, and the perpetual worry line between her brows began to fade. Robert became Keane's shadow, following him on ranch chores and soaking up knowledge about horses and cattle like a sponge. Eleanor, initially shy, blossomed under Josephine's gentle teaching, revealing a quick mind and artistic talent. Even baby Thomas seemed to thrive, his chubby legs soon carrying him on determined explorations of the cabin and yard. One evening in late October, as Josephine and Julia sat on the porch watching Keane teach Robert to whittle while Eleanor created an elaborate pine needle house for her doll, Julia turned to her sister with tears in her eyes. "I can never thank you enough," she said softly. "When William died, I thought our lives were over. I couldn't imagine how we would survive, let alone find joy again." She gestured toward the scene before them. "Yet here we are, and for the first time since I received word of his passing, I can envision a future." Josephine squeezed her sister's hand. "Your family, Julia, there's always a place for you here." "Even so," Julia insisted, "your husband has been more generous than I had any right to expect. Taking in a widow and 3 children is no small matter." "Keane understands family," Josephine replied, watching her husband demonstrate the proper angle for Robert's knife. "He lost his own too young. I think having all of you here has filled a place in his heart that's been empty a long time." What went unspoken was the healing Julia's children had brought to both Keane and Josephine, the joy of having young ones to nurture, even if they weren't their own by birth. Especially little Thomas, whose baby giggles and reaching arms had awakened a fierce protectiveness in Keane that surprised even him. As winter approached once more, it became clear that the cabin, spacious though it was for a couple, was growing somewhat cramped for 6 people. Without being asked, Keane began construction on an addition, 2 more bedrooms, and an expanded kitchen, working through increasingly cold days to have it enclosed before snow made building impossible. "You don't have to do this," Julia protested when she realized the scope of the project. "We could find our own place in town once I've saved enough from teaching piano lessons." "Nonsense," Keane replied, hammering a nail with perhaps more force than necessary. "Family stays together." He paused, setting down his hammer to look directly at Julia. "Unless you're unhappy here, no." She exclaimed, "The children have never been more content. I just don't want to be a burden." Keane's expression softened. "You're not a burden, Julia. You're Josephine's sister, which makes you my sister too." "And those children," he glanced toward where Robert and Eleanor were helping by sorting nails into piles. "They bring something to this house that it's been needing." The addition was completed just as the first heavy snow fell, transforming their expanded home into a warm haven against the winter's fury. Christmas that year was especially joyous, with the children's excitement adding a dimension of wonder that touched everyone. Keane outdid himself finding a perfect tree, which they decorated with popcorn strings, paper stars cut by Eleanor, and candles carefully placed and lit only on Christmas Eve. It was during these holiday celebrations, as they all sat around the fire after the children had gone to bed, that Julia made an announcement that would further alter the family dynamics. "I've been offered a position," she said somewhat hesitantly, "teaching music at the school in Central City. The pay is good and they've offered housing as part of the package." Josephine felt a pang at the thought of her sister and the children leaving. "Central City is almost 30 miles away." "I know," Julia acknowledged. "But it's an opportunity to stand on my own feet again, to provide for my children without depending on your charity." She looked directly at Keane. "You've done more than enough for us already. It's time we made our own way." Keane was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was rougher than usual. "You need to do what's best for you and your children, but I want you to know that you'll always have a home here if you need it." Later that night, as Josephine and Keane prepared for bed, she found him unusually pensive. "You're going to miss them," she observed, slipping her arms around his waist from behind. He nodded, covering her hands with his own. "More than I expected to." He turned to face her, his expression vulnerable in a way he rarely allowed anyone but her to see. "I never thought I'd be the type to get attached to children. Always figured my life would be too unsettled, too dangerous. And now I can't imagine this house without them," he sighed. "But Julia's right, she needs to make her own way. We can't stand in the way of that." Josephine rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Perhaps it's time we considered children of our own again." She felt Keane tense slightly. They had stopped actively discussing the subject months ago, after a particularly painful day when Josephine had realized that once again, her monthly cycle had arrived exactly on schedule. "Josephine," he began carefully, "if it hasn't happened by now, doctor." "Wilson says there's nothing physically wrong with either of us," she interrupted. "Sometimes these things just take time. And sometimes they don't happen at all," Keane replied gently. "I don't want you to keep disappointing yourself each month." Josephine pulled back to look into his eyes. "Would you consider another option?" "What do you mean?" "There are children who need homes," she said, the idea crystallizing as she spoke it aloud. "Orphans from the war, from mining accidents, from disease outbreaks, children who deserve a family as much as any child born to us would." Keane stared at her, understanding dawning in his eyes. "You're talking about adoption." "Yes," Josephine confirmed. "We have so much love to give, Keane. Does it really matter if the child who receives it shares our blood?" For a long moment, Keane was silent, his expression unreadable. Then slowly, a smile spread across his face, the same transformative smile that had first captured Josephine's heart on that mountain trail. "No," he said finally. "It doesn't matter at all." The conversation marked a turning point for them, both in acceptance that their family might take a different shape than they had initially imagined, but would be no less genuine for it. In the months that followed, as Julia and her children prepared for their move to Central City, Josephine quietly made inquiries about children in need of homes throughout Colorado territory. It was through one of these inquiries that they learned about twins, a boy and girl, barely 3 years old, whose parents had died in a mining camp fire near Silverton. The children had been temporarily taken in by a local family, but with 8 children of their own, they couldn't provide a permanent home. "Twins," Keane mused when Josephine showed him the letter describing the children's situation. That would be quite an undertaking for first-time parents. "Too much?" Josephine asked, trying to gauge his reaction. Keane's expression turned thoughtful. "My mother was a twin, always said it was like having a built-in best friend." He looked up at Josephine, his decision clearly made. "When can we go meet them?" The journey to Silverton was arduous, particularly in early spring when mountain passes were still treacherous with melting snow. But Josephine and Keane had faced more daunting challenges together, and the purpose of their trip lent urgency to each difficult mile. Matthew and Emma Davis were small for their age, with solemn eyes that had seen more tragedy than any child should endure. Their current guardians, the Hendersons, had clearly done their best, but the strain of caring for 10 children was evident in Mrs. Henderson's exhausted face. "They're good kids," she told Josephine and Keane as the twins played quietly in a corner. "Smart, too. Emma's already recognizing her letters, and Matthew can count to 20 without missing any numbers." The children regarded Josephine and Keane with cautious curiosity, responding to gentle questions with whispered answers and occasional shy smiles. By the end of the visit, Matthew had ventured close enough to examine the pocket watch Keane carried, a graduation gift from his father, while Emma had allowed Josephine to show her how to make a simple cat's cradle with string. "What do you think?" Keane asked quietly as they walked back to their lodgings that evening. Josephine didn't hesitate. "I think they're meant to be ours." The legal process was straightforward, given the circumstances. The territorial judge who handled such matters was primarily concerned that the children would have a stable home with parents who could provide for them. Keane's established mining claim and ranch, combined with Josephine's position as Georgetown's respected schoolteacher, satisfied these requirements easily. Within a week, Matthew and Emma Davis became Matthew and Emma Thompson, and the journey back to Georgetown began with two small additions to their family. The twins were subdued at first, clinging to each other and speaking little except in whispers between themselves. But as the miles passed and they began to trust that their new parents weren't going to disappear, their true personalities emerged. Matthew was the more adventurous of the pair, fascinated by horses and constantly asking keen questions about everything they saw along the trail. Emma was quieter but equally observant, her serious brown eyes missing nothing and her mind clearly processing every new experience with remarkable intelligence. By the time they reached Georgetown, the children were calling them Papa and Mama tentatively at first, then with increasing confidence as Josephine and Keane responded with consistent love and reassurance. Julia and her children were still at the Thompson home when they arrived, creating an instant extended family for the twins to be welcomed into. Robert immediately appointed himself official big cousin, showing Matthew his collection of interesting rocks and feathers with all the authority of his 8 years. Eleanor was enchanted by Emma, treating her like a living doll and proudly demonstrating her new reading skills to the younger girl. As Josephine watched the children together that first evening, she felt Keane's arm slip around her waist. "Look at them," he murmured in her ear, "like they've been family all along." "They have been," Josephine replied softly. "We just hadn't found each other yet." The next few months brought both joys and challenges as the twins adjusted to their new home, and Josephine and Keane learned the intricacies of parenthood. There were nightmares to soothe, particularly for Matthew, who retained more explicit memories of the fire that had taken his birth parents. There were boundaries to establish, routines to create, and 1,000 small lessons about what it meant to be part of the Thompson family. Through it all, Josephine marveled at Keane's natural aptitude for fatherhood. The man who had once been Georgetown's most confirmed bachelor transformed into a parent of infinite patience. Whether he was teaching Matthew to fish in the stream behind their property, or sitting for hours with Emma on his lap, reading the same story over and over because she couldn't bear for it to end. Julia and her children eventually moved to Central City as planned, but regular visits kept the cousins connected and gave the Thompson family a broader sense of belonging. The addition Keane had built proved perfect for these visits, with Julia remarking that it almost seemed as though he had anticipated their continued presence in the family's life. "Perhaps I did, subconsciously," Keane admitted when Josephine teased him about his foresight. "Or perhaps I just wanted to build something big enough to hold all the love I felt growing in this house." As the twins' 4th birthday approached in late summer, Josephine began planning a proper celebration there first as Thompsons. She was in the kitchen preparing a batch of sugar cookies when a wave of dizziness washed over her, forcing her to grip the edge of the table for support. "Mama," Emma's concerned voice broke through the momentary disorientation. "Are you sick?" Josephine managed a smile for her daughter. "Just a little tired, sweetheart, nothing to worry about." But the dizziness returned the next day and the day after that, accompanied by a persistent queasiness that was particularly acute in the morning hours. It was Julia, visiting for the weekend, who first suggested the obvious explanation. "When was your last monthly?" she asked bluntly as they sat together on the porch, watching Keane and the children build an elaborate fort from fallen branches. Josephine stared at her sister, mentally calculating. 6 weeks ago, at least." "But that's not unusual. I've never been particularly regular." Julia raised an eyebrow. "The nausea, the dizziness, the way you couldn't stomach the bacon at breakfast even though it's usually your favorite." "You think I'm—" Josephine couldn't quite bring herself to say the word, fear of disappointment still too raw. "I think Dr. Wilson might be worth a visit," Julia said gently, "just to be sure." The doctor's confirmation 2 days later left Josephine in a state of stunned disbelief. After nearly 3 years of marriage, after they had accepted that their family would grow through adoption rather than birth, After they had opened their hearts to Matthew and Emma now, against all expectations, she was with child. Keane's reaction when she told him that evening after the twins were asleep was everything Josephine could have hoped for. Initial shock gave way to a joy so profound it brought tears to his eyes. "A baby," he whispered, placing his hand gently on her still flat stomach. "Our baby." Then, with a sudden look of concern, "Are you happy about this, Josephine? It's quite a change of plans." "Happy doesn't begin to describe it," she assured him. "It feels like the completion of a circle somehow. As if Matthew and Emma prepared our hearts to be parents, and now we're being given this additional blessing." Keane gathered her into his arms, holding her as though she were made of the most precious porcelain. "I love you," he said fiercely. "I love our family, every single part of it." Telling the twins about the coming baby was an exercise in patience and careful explanation. At 4, their understanding of pregnancy and birth was naturally limited, but they grasped the essential concept that a new brother or sister would be joining their family in the spring. "Will you still be our mama and papa?" Matthew asked, his lower lip quivering slightly. "Always," Keane assured him, pulling both children onto his lap. "Having a new baby won't change that. Just like having 2 of you doesn't mean we love either of you any less." "Will the baby be a Thompson too?" Emma wanted to know. "Yes, sweetheart," Josephine answered. "Just like you and Matthew." Emma considered this seriously. "But we weren't always Thompsons, we were Davises first." The simple observation caught Josephine off guard. They had been open with the twins about their adoption, believing honesty was the foundation of trust, but they hadn't expected such clear understanding from a 4-year-old. "That's right," Keane said carefully. "You were born to Mr. and Mrs. Davis, who loved you very much. And then, when they couldn't take care of you anymore, you became our children Thompsons, like us." "But the baby in Mama's tummy was always a Thompson," Matthew concluded with the inexorable logic of childhood. "It didn't have to change." "That's true," Josephine acknowledged, meeting Keane's eyes over the children's heads. "But you know what? Sometimes the most important things in life are the ones we choose." She hugged both twins close. "And we chose you, Matthew and Emma Thompson. We chose to be your parents, just as you chose to be our children." It was, Josephine reflected later, the perfect articulation of what their family had become, a beautiful tapestry woven from choice rather than chance, from love rather than obligation. The baby growing within her would add another thread to that tapestry, different but equally precious. As Josephine's pregnancy progressed through autumn and into winter, Georgetown rallied around the Thompson family with characteristic community spirit. Mrs. Hollister organized a quilting circle to create a special blanket for the new baby. The school board arranged for a substitute teacher to take over Josephine's classes for the months surrounding the birth. Even the children's parents contributed, with mothers of Josephine's students providing a steady stream of advice, hand-me-down baby clothes, and hearty meals as her due date approached. Keane, meanwhile, threw himself into preparations with the same methodical thoroughness he applied to every important task. He built a cradle from pine harvested on their own land, carefully sanding each piece until it was satin smooth. He expanded his cattle herd, ensuring there would be ample income during Josephine's absence from teaching. He even arranged for Julia to stay with them for several weeks around the birth, recognizing that his wife would need another woman's support during that vulnerable time. The baby arrived on a clear, cold day in early March of 1875, a robust boy with a shock of dark hair and his father's blue eyes. They named him William Keane Thompson, honoring both Julia's late husband and his proud father. "He's perfect," Keane whispered, cradling his newborn son with hands that had once dispatched outlaws but now trembled slightly with the weight of this new responsibility. "Absolutely perfect." Josephine, exhausted but radiant, watched her husband and son with a heart so full it felt it might burst. "The twins?" she asked, her first thought after the baby's safe arrival being for their older children. "Waiting very impatiently to meet their brother," Keane replied with a smile. "Julia's barely keeping them contained in the kitchen with promises of special celebration cookies." When Matthew and Emma were finally allowed to tiptoe into the bedroom, their eyes wide with wonder at the tiny bundle in their mother's arms, Josephine felt the final piece of their family puzzle slide into place. The twins approached the bed cautiously, standing on tiptoes to peer at their new brother's scrunched face. "He's very small," Matthew observed, sounding slightly disappointed. "He'll grow," Keane assured him, lifting the boy so he could see better. "You were this small once too." "He has Papa's eyes," Emma said with satisfaction, clearly having already claimed this detail as significant. "And your mother's determination," Keane added with a wink at Josephine. "He arrived in quite a hurry once he made up his mind." As the twins carefully touched the baby's tiny fingers with expressions of awe, Josephine caught Keane's gaze across their children's heads. In his eyes, she read everything they had shared since that fateful day on the mountain, past danger and rescue, friendship and love, challenges overcome and joys discovered. Most of all, she saw the same certainty that filled her own heart, that whatever the future held, they would face it together as the family they had built through both circumstance and choice. Later that evening, with the twins finally asleep after the excitement of the day and baby William nursing contentedly at her breast, Josephine watched Keane add another log to the fire that kept their bedroom warm against the March chill. "Happy?" he asked, echoing the question he had posed on their wedding night. Josephine smiled, thinking of how far they had come from their first meeting, from the terrified Boston schoolteacher and the determined frontiersman to the parents of 3 children, the center of a loving family, the heart of a community. "Beyond words," she replied simply. "You." Keane settled beside her on the bed, his arm encircling her shoulders as he gazed down at their son. "I once told you that when I rode out to intercept that stagecoach, I was just doing what needed doing." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "But now I know it was much more than that. It was the best decision I ever made, the one that led to everything good in my life." As William finished nursing and drifted to sleep in the secure circle of his parents' embrace, Josephine leaned her head against Keane's shoulder, content in the knowledge that their story, which had begun with danger and courage on a mountain trail, would continue to unfold in this home they had created together, surrounded by the love that had transformed them both. The stagecoach ambush that had once seemed like the worst moment of Josephine's life had, in fact, been its greatest blessing, the beginning of an adventure far richer and more fulfilling than any she could have imagined when she left Boston seeking independence. In Keane Thompson, she had found not a constraint on that independence, but a partner who valued her strength, her intelligence, and her courage, who had fought for her that first day and continued fighting for their shared happiness every day since. And in that knowledge, secure in the family they had built together, Josephine Thompson found a peace and joy that completed the journey she had begun on that fateful day when her stagecoach was ambushed by 6 outlaws and a cowboy fought them off and rode her home.